series, Islam After Colonialism. Just to say, it's conventional to begin with the rationale behind a series, so I'll start with that. Islam After Colonialism obviously assumes that colonialism brought about a dramatic transformation in Islam, whatever that is. When we began this series, it was immediately pointed out rightly that, in fact, in a very, very important sense, Islam itself as a historical collective singular agent, as it were, which is how we moderns think of it, was itself a modern and a colonial construction. So there's that to begin with, but Islam after colonialism, it should be obvious now today, given the Anthropocene, that the past couple of 100 years have brought about an extraordinary transformation in the nature of human societies. Obviously, the Earth system itself, which is what the Anthropocene names, and naturally, that would have corresponded to a dramatic transformation within the human sphere itself. It could not have happened otherwise. So we know today, like we've never known before, that this period is a period of extraordinary transformation. So there is not just a particularistic rationale behind this inquiry. There is, in some sense, a universal rationale today for all of us to reevaluate what we take to be our inheritance, and especially given the distance that separates us from what, in fact, had been the case, or had a very different pace of change from what happened over the past couple of 100 years. So with that brief introduction, I will ask my colleague from University of Exeter, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, to introduce our speaker for today. Very excited. His work is directly relevant to the series, and Sajjad will tell you more about him.
Thank you, Nauman. It is indeed a pleasure to be introducing SherAli Tareen. He will be speaking on interreligious polemics in colonial South Asia, Miracles history, and Miracles history, political theology, which in some ways develops from his earlier project, which I'll say something about in a second, and is part of a second monograph project on Hindu-Muslim encounters in this colonial period. And we'll, of course, I'm sure, discuss how this relates to the sort of encounters that we were discussing a few weeks ago with Shankar Nair, and with other kinds of phenomena with respect to political theology in more recent times as well. SherAli Tareen is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College, and where he's been teaching since 2012. And he is probably known to quite a number of people who might be watching this already as the author of Defending Muhammad in Modernity, which came out with Notre Dame University Press last year, which is, in some ways, it's remarkable that it's the first attempt to explain the whole Barelvi Deobandi thing in an academic format. But it is, and it's a very successful explanation of how the identities of Barelvi and Deobandi as they develop as reformist movements in the British colonial period in South Asia constitute rival political theologies, rival conceptions of sovereignty, rival conceptions of justice, of order, of society. And also, I'm sure a number of you will be also familiar with SherAli through the New Books Network. You will have heard his voice and on many of those interviews about new books, and it's a wonderful resource. I mean, it's before the current explosion maybe of digital content, which we've been experiencing since COVID-19. New books was really a sort of a game changer in many ways, and I think it's been a wonderful way of introducing us to the authors, hearing them, and also a very useful way. For example, when I was on the train down to Exeter, of keeping me busy on the train, listening to stuff and using my time profitably. So I'm not going to say much else. I've already mentioned that this is part of SherAli's second project, which develops from the first book. And it's, in many ways, it's a very obvious kind of development because of the way in which arguably defending Muhammad in modernity was sort of the intra-Muslim aspect, although the interreligious aspect was imminent in it. And now it's kind of become making the imminent a bit more sort of clear and explicit. And I'm sure we will talk about some of the the very famous controversies there were, Hindu-Muslim controversies, Muslim-Christian controversies, etc., which in many ways did actually feature the centrality of the person of the Prophet himself, and that of course makes it rather timely as well, given what has been the ongoing kind of I would say slightly boorish developments in France. Not boorish for those who are suffering from it, but certainly for those of us outside, you sort of think, well, are we having this again? And the classic kind of myopia of the historical inheritances that the current situation yields to us. So anyway, without further ado, I want to then pass the mic, so to speak, to SherAli. So please, Professor Tareen, if you will present us with your talk, and there will be, after that, there will be, of course, some discussion from Nauman and myself, and there will be plenty of time for those of you who are watching this online to ask questions and comment as well at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nauman and Sajjad, for this kind invitation. Congratulations to both of you for putting up this extraordinary series. Really has been a tremendous resource, and Sajjad is mentioning this might continue in the spring, so that's really exciting. And thank you for this invitation. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you to all of you who might have tuned in on Facebook Live or who will watch this later as part of a link. As Sajjad mentioned, my comments today are drawn from my second and current book project, which tentatively is titled The Promise and Peril of Hindu-Muslim Friendship. And I will be sharing with you some fragments of one specific chapter in that book project that I'm currently working on. Before I get to that specific chapter, let me explain a bit the larger sort of theme or the question that I'm interested in this larger book, which is that the book really interrogates the multiplicity of ways in which prominent Indian Muslim scholars, especially the traditionally educated ulama, understood Islam's relationship with Hindu thought, life, and practice in early modern and modern South Asia, from the late 18th to the early 20th century. And the central conceptual question that animates this project is, how did South Asian ulama negotiate the incongruence between the pre-modern political context of Muslim empire that informed foundational normative texts and attitudes towards non-Muslims, and the setting of colonial modernity that saw Muslims in South Asia rendered into a numerical as well as a political minority. In simpler words, how are the resources and legacy of a pre-modern normative tradition engaged and navigated in the massively transformed conditions of colonial modernity? So I have some comments that I've written down to just stay within my time limit of around 35 minutes is what I plan on speaking for. Before I speak, I just mentioned that my wife and I have a 6-month-old at home, and I'm away from the office because of the pandemic. So if you hear any cries and shrieks in the background, that's Ajab Khan Tareen. He can't be stopped, so I'm just letting you know. So here I go. On the early morning of March 17th, 1876, Muhammad Qāsim Nānotvī died 1877, one of the founders of the prestigious South Asian Islamic seminary, the Deoband Madrasa, that was established in 1866. He boarded a train from his native village of Nanota, hence his name was Nānotvī, in Uttar Pradesh, northern India. Traveling via Delhi, his eventual destination was the small village of Chandapur in the North Indian district of Shahjahanpur. The objective of Nānotví's visit to Chandapur was to participate in an interreligious polemical festival known as the festival of deciding the true God, mela-e Khuda Shanasi. In the historiography of Deoband, this event is also remembered as the polemic of Shahjahanpur, Mubahisa-e Shahjahanpur. My comments today center on certain key fragments of the Shahjahanpur polemic to explore and examine conceptions of religion and interreligious difference that it brought into view. The polemical festival of Shahjahanpur brought together leading Christian missionaries and Hindu and Muslim scholars in India charged with the task of debating and defending the authenticity of their respective religions. Qāsim Nānotvī, who led the contingent of Muslim scholars at this event, as many of you might know, is a towering figure in the intellectual history of Islam in South Asia. An illustrious jurist, theologian, and major Sufi master, Nānotví's scholarly output was at once vast and multi-layered. Although he died at a relatively young age of 44, he wrote prolifically on a broad range of subjects, including law, theology, philosophy, and Sufism, in addition to his polemical texts. In the historiography of Deoband, he is remembered as an extremely difficult writer whose deeply philosophical and esoteric orientation often made his thought inscrutable, even to his own peers. He is also remembered as an avowedly reclusive and ascetic personality who shunned worldly attention as much as possible, despite his position as a leading Muslim scholar cum reformer of his era. Nānotvī participated in the Shahjahanpur polemic during the twilight of his career. He died in 1877, only a year after the second iteration of this event. Now, apart from Qāsim Nānotvī, the most prominent religious figure who attended this festival was the arch polemicist and founder of the Hindu reformist group, the Arya Samaj, Dayananda Saraswati, died 1883. Saraswati had very recently, in 1875, published his scandalous polemic against different religious traditions, including Islam, Christianity, etc., called Satyarth Prakash, the light of truth. In a chapter devoted exclusively to Islam, Dayananda had scathingly mocked the Quran and Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, causing a fury among Muslim scholars. Finally, the leading protagonist representing Christianity at this event was a man named Father Knowles. Knowles was a British missionary in Shahjahanpur of the Methodist Episcopal Mission who had served as a headmaster of a local missionary school for a number of years. He had rapidly grown in prominence thanks to his remarkably aggressive and effective proselytizing campaigns in the region. A charismatic and aggressive debater, Knowles had participated in a series of such polemics in North India, though none of this scale. Let me describe this polemical festival a bit more for you. The polemical festival of Shahjahanpur was organized through the patronage of the British magistrate of the district called Robert George Gray. In addition to Gray, the primary sponsor of the event, who also handled all the logistical arrangements, was a certain Munshi Pyare Lal, a wealthy Hindu landowner of Shahjahanpur. It was Pyare Lal who had originally devised the idea of a public showdown between religious scholars from competing traditions, and then supervised its execution. Thus, one can think of the Shahjahanpur polemic as a joint effort between the machineries of the colonial state and the indigenous landed elite. Now, why would the colonial state be interested in patronizing such spectacles of interreligious encounter? While the question of motives is never quite clear, what is clearly at work here is the expression of a modern colonial logic of secularism, whereby the domain of religious passions and contest is protected and even celebrated, and yet also quarantined from the spheres of politics and governance. The physical and discursive site of the Shahjahanpur polemic reinforced the dual colonial promise of advancing the mission of civilizing the native through missionary activity and separating the field of interreligious indigenous quarrels and debate from that of politics and state governance. I will return to this point towards the end of my comments. Preparations for this event had been underway for many months in advance. It was heavily advertised in local newspapers and through the distribution of pamphlets in local schools, shops, and other public venues. The reason I'm going through these details is that one of the key themes of my comments today that I really want to think about is the relationship between the new institutional and technological conditions of colonial modernity and these new ways of debating and engaging with the category of religion. Hence, these details are important to my larger argument here. In addition to the participants of this polemic, hundreds of people from neighboring towns and villages, especially Deoband, Meerut, Delhi, Rampur, Moradabad, and Bareilly, attended the event and served as spectators to this mega polemical showdown. The participating scholars also made their way to Shahjahanpur from various parts of northern India on the train. For instance, Qāsim Nānotvī, accompanied by a retinue of around 20 disciples and associates, some professional polemicists, and others driven by the anticipation of entertainment, traveled more than 400 miles on the train from Deoband to Shahjahanpur via Delhi. Nānotvī had been invited to this festival by the local Muslims of Shahjahanpur who had desired a prominent Muslim scholar to defend Islam at the event, and Nānotvī willingly obliged their request and took on the mantle of leadership. The actual event, where was this held? How was it held? It was held under large tents that had been put up on a tract of barren land in Chandapur. Each contingent representing Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism were camped in their own respective tents, retiring to their lodges after each day's proceedings. The British Magistrates' Office provided more than 200 chairs, food, and other necessary items for the event. They also arranged for the local police to monitor the venue and to prevent the eruption of violence. The festival lasted for 4 days. During the course of this 4-day polemic, representative scholars from each religion took turns in delivering speeches and in responding to rebuttals and objections as they battled for the assent and attention of the assembled public. The public for this event comprised members of all three religious traditions, with Hindus and Muslims far outnumbering Christians. In addition to doctrinal competition and contestation, proselytizing represented another crucial component of this polemic. For instance, one of the most interesting and curious stories that we see in the Deoband historiography of this event. While he was not occupied with debating responsibilities, Qāsim Nānotvī would often devote his energies to maximizing the proselytizing opportunities available at the festival. In among the most arresting moments during the polemic, Nānotvī once invited one of his chief opponents, Father Knowles, the Christian missionary scholar, to become Muslim. While they were alone in a tent during one of the breaks, Nānotvī praised Knowles' sincerity and passion for God's servitude and urged him to embrace the most complete and current religion, Islam. After listening patiently to Nānotví's invitation, Knowles replied, "I thank you for thinking so much about my welfare, and I will keep your advice in mind." The polemic itself focused on a range of theological and philosophical problems, including monotheism, divine will, human agency, the problem of evil, rebirth and transmigration, tanasukh, prophetic miracles, and authenticity of scriptures, so on and so forth, as each side strived to establish the exclusive authenticity of its doctrinal system. While the range of questions discussed was expansive, the primary focus of this polemic did center on theological issues and conundrums. What was salvation and how it is achieved? How could God both be just and merciful at the same time? With what matter did God create the world, when and how? How can one prove that the Vedas, Bible, or the Quran represent the true word of God? What are heaven and hell? Where are they? Etc. As one might expect, no conclusive resolution was found, and each side in their respective versions and historiographies of this event have claimed victory. While in the larger chapter, I go into a lot more of the details of these different issues, for the remainder of my comments today, for the next 25 minutes or so, I want to focus exclusively on one specific discursive moment that became visible during this polemic as a way to make my larger argument for my talk today. And that specific topic is Qāsim Nānotví's discussion on the superiority of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad's miracles over the miracles of other prophets. Through a close examination of Nānotví's contribution to and combat over these interreligious miracle wars, as I call them, that were centered on the question of whose miracle is most miraculous, I hope to raise and address larger questions connected to the conceptual and epistemic position of religion in the discursive economy of late 19th century India. More specifically, the main questions that I will address and that concern me are three. One, what notion of religion animated Nānotví's polemics? Two, what conception of time and history informed the way he imagined religion? And three, in what ways was his understanding of religion as a category indebted to the secularizing conditions of British colonial modernity? Miracles provide a potentially productive site through which to ask such questions. Situated at the intersection of the intelligible and the uncanny, the knowable and the unknowable, miracles can highlight the ambiguities involved in approaching religion as a set of propositional truth claims readily available for comparison, contestation, evaluation, and objectification. In the discussion that follows, by closely navigating the logic of Nānotvī's arguments on the question of miracles, I hope to bring some of these ambiguities into view. Let me first set the contextual stage for this debate. Why were Nānotvī and Dayananda Saraswati locked in a debate on prophetic miracles in the first place? The context is this. In his text Satya Prakash, or the Light of Truth, Dayananda Saraswati had impugned Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in devastating fashion, often calling him an impostor. He had especially attacked the credibility of miracles attached to Muhammad and of miracles found in the Quran more generally. So during the polemical festival of Shahjahanpur, as a response to Saraswati's provocations, Nānotvī sought to restore Prophet Muhammad's authority by showing the superiority of his miracles over the miracles of all other prophets. According to Nānotvī, in comparison to miracles found in other religious traditions, Muhammad's miracles were the most incredible and hence the most authoritative. To be clear, Nānotví's point was not that the miracles associated with other prophets were not authentic or truthful. They certainly were and fully were. Rather, his point was that Prophet Muhammad's miracles were the most improbable and hence the most miraculous. Let me walk you through his logic with the help of a few examples, and then I will connect it to the larger point that I'm trying to make here. As a case in point, Nānotvī narrated the well-known story of the miraculous gushing of water from Prophet Muhammad's fingers in Madina, as he, to quote him, at a market in Madina, some 300 of Prophet Muhammad's companions needed water to perform their ablutions for prayer. Muhammad called for a bucket of water and placed his hands in it, and suddenly water began to flow copiously from between his fingers, enough for his followers to use. Nānotvī argued that the flow of water from Prophet Muhammad's fingers was much more miraculous than Moses' miracle of causing water to burst out from a stone after hitting it with a stick. According to Nānotvī, there was nothing particularly incredible about causing water to flow from a stone. After all, he reasoned, when one strikes the ground with a stick, one would expect the water below the surface to rise above the surface. In contrast, Nānotvī continued, it is certainly incredible for water to flow from human limbs. More importantly, for Nānotvī, the gushing of water from Prophet Muhammad's fingers demonstrated the effect of the charisma of the Prophet's body. It was the embodied character of Prophet Muhammad's miracle that made it overwhelmingly superior to Moses' miracle. While Moses' miracle was perfectly legitimate, it lacked the bodily charisma, jismani, barkat-e jismani, found in Muhammad's miracle. Nānotvī continued his argument by narrating the well-known story, and I will spend a little time on this story, of the moment when the pain of separation from the Prophet had caused a dying date palm tree to cry and moan in anguish. During his first few months in Madina, after migrating there from Mecca in 622, Prophet Muhammad used to deliver his Friday sermons leaning against a shriveled date palm tree, since a mosque had not yet been built in Madina. Later, when Al-Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet's mosque, was built and a pulpit installed, Prophet Muhammad began delivering his sermons from the newly constructed pulpit. This newly pulpit was situated nearby the date palm tree. One Friday, when several people had gathered for the weekly congregational prayers, they heard the date palm tree moan hysterically. The tree was crying from the pain of separation from the touch of the Prophet's back. After seeing the tree cry in a state of shock and anguish, Muhammad consoled and hugged the tree, just like a father would pacify his son. Nānotvī explained that when the tree moaned from the pain of longing for Prophet Muhammad, it moaned because of its love for Muhammad's charisma. The tree's pain was generated and animated by love. But according to Nānotvī, this was no ordinary love. Only the most spiritually talented people can realize this kind of passionate love. It is not available for every ordinary person. In order to love the Prophet, Nānotvī punctuated, one must physically experience the certainty of Muhammad's perfection, Kamal. In Nānotvī's view, the charisma of the Prophet's touch had inspired a lifeless tree to achieve such impeccable certainty. In making his argument, Nānotvī drew on a popular Sufi distinction between three progressive levels of certainty. What are these progressive levels? One, certainty derived from knowledge, or from what one might call discursive certainty. You know something and hence you're certain about it. Ilmul yaqeen. Certainty derived from observation. You see something, you observe something, and hence you become certain of it. Ainul yaqeen. And then the highest level, which is certainty derived from physical experience or embodiment, embodied certainty, haqqul yaqeen. Love, Muhammad, Nānotvī argued, can only mature in someone who had attained the highest form of certainty, certainty derived from experience or embodiment, haqqul yaqeen. According to Nānotvī, certainty derived from knowledge cannot generate love. If it could have, he reasoned, then millions of people living today would have been in love with Joseph and with all figures from the past known to have been beautiful. Just knowing about their beauty does not make one love them. Similarly, Nānotvī continued, certainty derived from observation cannot produce love. For instance, one cannot begin to desire sweets, mithai, simply by observing them. In order to desire those sweets, one must also consume them and physically experience their taste. The cultivation of love depends on precisely this kind of consumption or embodied experience. Embodied certainty is a necessary condition for love. And it is the highest stage of certainty that only the most accomplished mystics, mutasawwifin, and scholars, ulama, can attain. This kind of certainty was available exclusively to the most talented and spiritually gifted of God's creation. According to Nānotvī, the date palm tree that cried because of its separation from the Prophet had attained embodied certainty. The tree's agony was inspired by its love for Muhammad. That love, in turn, was generated by the physical experience, the embodied certainty of Muhammad's perfection. So in Nānotvī's thought, love was not an intellectual condition that could be understood through empirical observation or knowledge. Rather, the cultivation of love depended on attuning the body to the task of physically realizing the certainty of Muhammad's perfection. Now, why was this miracle then so extraordinary? Muhammad's miracle was extraordinary because it transformed a lifeless tree into someone who had attained a level of spiritual excellence that was unthinkable without years of education, training, and discipleship. The tree's love for the Prophet distinguished it not only from other trees, plants, or animals, but from almost the entirety of humanity. Muhammad's miracle of causing a withering tree to cry from the pain of separation was also, Nānotvī continued, and this was his main point, far superior to the miracles of other prophets. For example, he argued that it was far superior to Jesus' miracle of bringing the dead back to life. Why? Because, he argued, this was so because a dead body had a relationship with the soul prior to its death. But the date palm tree that was brought to life by Muhammad had no relationship whatsoever with the soul or with life. Moreover, he reasoned, the relationship between the body and the soul is much like the relationship between a magnet and iron. The soul and the body have a magnetic relationship. So the soul would be expected to return to the body if an externally applied force that kept them separated were removed. However, the date palm tree that Muhammad brought back to life had no organic relationship with life. It is for the same reason, he continued, that Muhammad's miracle was also far superior from Moses' well-known miracle of transforming a stick into a snake. Nānotvī claimed, and his reasoning went as follows: when Moses gave life to a stick by turning it into a snake, that stick only came to life in the form of a snake with which life is intimately connected. Moses had made a stick act like a snake only when that stick had taken the form of a snake. Moreover, once that stick became a snake, it acted in ways that one expects from snakes. It began running around, biting, poisoning, all actions that are associated with the physical form of a snake. In other words, in Moses' miracle, there was a perfect similitude between the post-miracle form of the object on which the miracle was performed and the actions that are usually associated with that form. In contrast, in Muhammad's miracle, one found a complete dissonance between the original form of the object on which the miracle was enacted and the actions that emanated from that form. A date palm tree who had reached a level of certainty that only is associated with the most accomplished scholars and mystics. So the superiority of Muhammad's miracle over Moses' miracle lay precisely in the radicality of the transformation it had brought about. Muhammad had transformed a dying tree into a paragon of spiritual excellence. into someone who was radically different from and completely unrelated to its original form. Again, the key point here is that his miracle was generated by the charisma of his body. This idea of radical disruption in the original form of an object is also what made what is arguably the Prophet's most famous miracle, splitting the moon in half, shaqqul qamar or inshiqaqul qamar, more miraculous, Nānotvī argued, than say Prophet Joshua or Yusha alayhi salam's miracle of keeping the sun stationary for a long time, which Nānotvī argued simply confirmed nature's law that all forms of movement eventually come to rest. Splitting the moon asunder in half, in contrast, was a lot more, and here I quote him, scientifically impossible because of the way it completely opposed the laws of nature, and hence it was a more miraculous miracle. Now, having established the superiority of Prophet Muhammad's miracles over the miracles of Jewish and Christian prophets in the Islamic tradition, Nānotvī offered an explanation for why he had omitted any mention of Hindu miracles in his discussion. And this is important to my argument because it connects to his conception of time and history that undergirds his discourse. The logic of his explanation for why he omitted any mention of Hindu miracles was quite revealing here. He argued that the main reason for this omission from his exposition was the poor standards of historical writing that marked the Hindu tradition. As he put it, and I quote him here, no historian would consider histories of the Hindus as reliable. For instance, Nānotvī explained the splitting of the moon was also mentioned in the Mahabharata as an event that took place during the reign of the celebrated Hindu sage Vishwamitra. However, Nānotvī bemoaned, one finds no reliable chain of transmission, sanad, connecting the author of the Mahabharata with the narrator from the era of Vishwamitra. He proceeded to speculate, and I quote him, that in all probability, the Hindus have stolen the moon splitting incident from Muslim historiography. According to Nānotvī, this kind of historical ineptitude stood in stark contrast with a Muslim tradition that was universally recognized for its historicist prowess. As Nānotvī triumphantly put it, and I quote him here, no religion can rival Islam in the department of establishing the soundness of religious discourse and oral traditions. Especially the narrative of the Prophet's splitting of the moon is beyond any doubt. This event was documented in prophetic reports, ahadith, that were massively transmitted with uninterrupted chains of transmission. It was also mentioned in the Quran, a text that was memorized by millions of people from the beginnings of Islam until today. Now, crucial to Nānotví's argument for the superiority of Muslim miracles over Hindu miracles was the claim that Islam had more superior standards of historicism. For Nānotvī, note here, history represented the discursive battleground on which the authenticity of a religious tradition was to be contested and determined. Now, there was a problem here. If Muslim standards of historical empiricism were so unrivaled, then why was this event, the Prophet's splitting of the moon, not recorded in world histories? This was a question that Dayananda Saraswati, the founder of the Arya Samaj, had raised in his attempt to undermine the authenticity of this story. In his text, Satya Prakash, Saraswati had argued that the absence of the splitting of the moon narrative in the world histories clearly showed that Muslims had fabricated the story and attached it to Prophet Muhammad. But Nānotvī was not to be outshone so easily in the department of empiricist chauvinism. Nānotvī responded to Dayananda's charge of fabrication on the part of Muslims by first reminding his arch-rival that even Hindu miracles are not found in histories of the world. As Nānotvī sarcastically asked, in which history of the world was Mahabharata's narrative of the splitting of the moon in Vishwamitra's reign recorded? Nānotvī proceeded to explain the absence of the Muslim moon splitting incident in world histories through arguments that combined a desire for scientific certitude with a remarkable penchant for theatrical apologetics. According to Nānotvī, people in India and in Western countries did not observe the splitting of the moon because of the time of the day when that incident took place. As he put it, and I quote him, at the time when the moon was split in half, the moon had just risen above the horizon. This is suggested by the fact that the mountain of Hira outside Mecca, which is not very high, could be seen between the two pieces of the split moon. Nānotvī continued, and I quote him, at that time it must have been approaching midnight in India, and dawn had not yet struck in Western countries. According to this, add to this the fact that it was the middle of the winter. People in India were buried under their blankets. They were intoxicated in their dreams, unaware of even their own existence. In this condition, it was impossible for them to take notice of an event like the splitting of the moon that took place for only a few fleeting seconds. And even if someone were awake at that time, why on earth would he be staring at the sky in anticipation for the moon to split? Moreover, the pollution and the dust in the air must have made it very difficult to see the sky clearly. End of quote. Now, Nānotvī's triumphalist reading in relation to other religious traditions was animated, this is my point here, by a particular understanding of time and history. According to this narrative, the authenticity of a religion depended on its capacity to be empirically historicized. A religion could only be counted as such if its history could be empirically accounted for. In this empiricist scheme, Hinduism was not even part of history proper. Its traditions and miracles were too unreliable to be worthy of historical consideration. Only the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were part of time and history proper. Moreover, Islam represented the culmination and completion of history. While Christian and Jewish miracles were legitimate, they had been superseded by Prophet Muhammad's miracles. Islam was the most current of all religious traditions. Now, Nānotvī made this argument about the historical inevitability of Islam's superiority over other religions with a particularly arresting analogy from the world of colonial politics. And this connects to my larger point about the conditions of colonial modernity and the texture of these religious debates and discourses. He reasoned, and I quote him here. He said, say someone in India refused to follow the injunctions of the current Governor General, Lord Lytton, who was Viceroy from 1876 to 1880, and insisted that he will only follow the laws set by the previous Governor General, Lord Northbrook, who ruled from 1872 to 1876. The same government appointed both of them. However, the refusal to follow the laws of the most current Governor General will constitute treason and an open challenge to the sovereignty of the government. Similarly, refusing to follow the most current of all religions, Islam, and insisting on following previous religions that have now become outdated represents an affront to God's sovereignty. As this analogy shows, Nānotvī's conception of historical movement was ensconced in a political theology, animated by neat correspondence between divine and state sovereignty. The covenant of servitude binding a human to God was symmetrical to a citizen's loyalty to the state. Moreover, much like challenging the sovereignty of the state constituted treason, refusing to comply with the dictates of divine sovereign represented heresy. Just as treason against the colonial state constituted grounds for the loss of citizenship, treason against God made one vulnerable to the charge of unbelief. Nānotvī's conception of the relationship between religion and history thus was leavened by a thoroughly modern political theology in which the sovereignty of the state mirrored the sovereignty of the divine. The symbolism of modern state sovereignty permeated his theological imaginary, and in his intellectual apparatus, theology and politics were intimately attached, inseparably interwoven on the fabric of history. So to conclude, what is a larger point? What are the larger conceptual points I want to make through what has preceded? Very briefly, in a few minutes. My point is that in many ways, the polemical festival of Shahjahanpur, some brief fragments of which I've shared with you today, was authorized by the secularizing conditions of British colonial modernity. This polemical festival was made possible by a confluence of the comprehensive socio-political alterations brought about by British colonialism in India. What were these transformations? The emergence of a new public sphere in which the state at once managed and patronized religious debates. The availability of a new conceptual object called religion that was known through its propositional doctrines. And the emergence of a new kind of subject whose job it was to decide on the truth and untruth of competing religious claims. In addition to the technologies of a capitalist economy such as print, railways, and an emerging postal system that also played a pivotal part in catalyzing such public sites of contestations, we also see a new social space in the polemic of Shahjahanpur, whereby it is the assembled public and these rival scholars who, of course, make their way through the train. And how is this advertised? Through pamphlets and the printing press, etc. So this is one major transformation, the institutional and technological conditions of colonial modernity that makes this polemic possible in the first place. But in addition to that, and what I'm more interested in fact, is that this polemic also highlighted a new epistemic space in which the question of religion was now and henceforth imagined. And this comes to the larger theme of the speaker series, Islam after Colonialism. During this polemic, the indigenous religious elite responded to the colonial demand to retrieve the exclusive authenticity of a fully translatable body of knowledge called religion. Moreover, and this is the crucial shift here, the affirmation of that authenticity depended on the negation of all rival religions. The authorization of the self demanded the unauthorization of difference. This inverse relationship between identity and difference was indebted to a modern secular politics of accountability. According to this logic of accountability, identity must account for itself in order to be counted. The moment of accounting for an identity is also the moment of constructing for it a memory of the self that differs from its various others. This dynamic of the relationship between indigenous religious communities fully conformed to a secular colonial politics of representation. Now, to be absolutely clear, and to address a possible objection to my argument here. My argument here is not, and I will finish in a couple of minutes. My argument here is not that the idea of religious polemics was a colonial invention of the 19th century. That's not my point. To the contrary, one finds a long-standing tradition of both written and oral polemics, munazara, in the intellectual history of Islam, including intra-Muslim and interreligious polemics. The discursive archive of pre-modern Muslim legal and theological traditions is populated by a fair number of polemical moments. Therefore, one may argue that Qāsim Nānotvī's participation at the festival of Shahjahanpur represented only a continuity of pre-modern Muslim traditions of polemics. It was also part of a long-running tradition of Muslim dialectical theology, or ilmul kalam, of which Nānotvī himself was an important part, that was meant to establish Islam's authenticity and superiority over other faith traditions through rational argument. And there was nothing new or novel about a discussion on the subject of miracles. Miracles or mu'jizat represent a major theme in the biographical seerah and hadith literature relating to Prophet Muhammad, and also in Sufi texts and traditions. However, and this is my point, despite these seeming continuities, the expenditure of Nānotvī's polemical energy at Shahjahanpur and his discourse on prophetic miracles signified a major rupture from the past. This is so for a few reasons. One, first is the notion of the public that made this polemic possible. There was something radically new about the idea of a religious polemic organized and fought out for the spectatorship and consumption of a defined public. Certainly, the impulse to morally educate the masses had always been an important part of Muslim thought. However, pre-modern polemical moments in Islam that usually focused on questions of law, language, doxology, etc., were for the most part an elite enterprise. Involvement in polemics was largely contained to the religious, scholarly, and the political elite, often staged in the theater of the imperial court, such as, for example, in the Abbasid period especially. Now, the polemic of Shahjahanpur was also followed by the scholarly elite. These are all elites, Dayananda Saraswati, Qāsim Nānotvī, etc. But, and this is my point, pivotal to its logic and its condition of possibility was the spectatorship of a public readily available to be reformed, preached, and doctrinally persuaded. The witnessing capacity of the public represented the polemic's condition of possibility. In fact, this polemic was as much a competition for the assent of the public as it was about doctrinal contestation. Second reason why this is a rupture. In addition to the publicity of this polemical festival, it also showcased a resoundingly modern conceptual apparatus through which competing arguments were contested. As just mentioned, miracles have always represented an important part of Muslim intellectual and mystical traditions. However, one would be very hard-pressed to find instances of a pre-modern Muslim scholar striving to explain, justify, and defend the absence of a prophetic miracle in world histories. The idea that the authenticity of miracles hinges on their documentation in world histories would have been unthinkable prior to the 18th and 19th centuries. This idea signifies a remarkable shift in the conceptual status of history as the sovereign decider of authenticity and the arbiter of competing normative claims. Indeed, the very anxiety to record, historicize, rationalize, and authenticate the miraculous is fully compatible with the modern secular fantasy of canonizing, cataloging, counting, and accounting for life. And third, and finally, and this is my key point, the polemic of Shahjahanpur also reflected a major shift in the epistemic position of religion as a category. The notion of religion that animated and sustained this polemical festival was perhaps its most peculiarly modern feature, which is best captured in the very name of this event, the festival of deciding the true God. As this name suggests, underlying this polemic was the assumption that religion constitutes a rationally accessible discursive space, essentially reducible to the figure of a transcendent God. Moreover, the authenticity of such a theologically centered religion was readily available to be evaluated, historicized, and mobilized for doctrinal competition. In short, religion was perfectly translatable and thoroughly religionized, entirely compatible with the ideological demands and desires of empire. Now, so to sum up, the point is that there was nothing new, while there was nothing new in Nānotvī's engagement in polemics or in him discussing the subject of prophetic miracles, but the conceptual and institutional terrain that he was participating in at Shahjahanpur was a terrain that was not of his making or doing. It was a terrain dominated by a colonial state that had once managed and patronized religious polemics in the public sphere, and this terrain was resoundingly new. But I want to offer one important qualifier, and on that I will end. One important addendum to this larger argument that is important. As much as Qāsim Nānotvī's discourse on prophetic miracles was made possible by the secularizing conditions of colonial modernity, which is my larger point, it would also be conceptually problematic to read this moment of polemical activity as an instance of a secular disenchantment of religion or religious identity. So just because he draws on science and the language of sort of rational explanation, it doesn't mean that this is some kind of a call for a Weberian disenchantment of the public sphere. In fact, what I've actually shown in my comments today is that exactly to the contrary, what we find in this discussion is that there is what one might call an enchantment war, whereby far from jettisoning or rejecting the miraculous or the uncanny, Nānotvī actually is trying to outperform his rivals in the question of whose miracle was most miraculous, incredible, and beyond comprehension. But even if he is not a protagonist of Weberian disenchantment, my argument has been that underlying his argumentative apparatus nonetheless was a desire to rationalize, historicize, and objectify the miraculous. After all, the very question, whose miracle is most miraculous, can only stand authorized by the assumption that miracles represent objects readily available for verification, evaluation, comparison, and rationalization. So the point, the larger argument is that while Nānotvī played the polemical game at Shahjahanpur by choosing his own discursive strategies and tactics, he was obliged to play that game according to rules that were not of his choosing. These rules were inspired by a modern secular conceptuality that thrived on approaching religion as an ideological object whose limits were always available for comparison, contestation, and decision. As much as Qāsim Nānotvī was defending his tradition from the threat of competing others at the polemic of Shahjahanpur, he was conscripted into a political rationality of secular colonial modernity. In other words, he was at once a defender of tradition and, as anthropologist David Scott so famously called, a conscript of modernity. Sorry, I went a few minutes over my allotted time, but thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to the commentary and the questions. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was so rich, conceptually rich and dramatic as well. Thank you so much for that scintillating talk. Sajjad, may I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
There's so much to discuss, but I'll just run a couple of questions by you. First, the 1876. So we're in this space just a few years after the census, and thus also your reference to accounting for oneself and counting oneself. Yeah. So it's a remarkable period, of course, the 1870s, 1880s, and precisely because of this historicization. Yeah, this is the moment, of course. Soon after you'll have Hali, Shibli, Sharar, Muhammad Hussain Azad, all of that. These massive historicization, very deliberate efforts are made to historicize religion, Muslim religion, in all kinds of different ways, and you've picked a particularly rich, precise, and most striking and troubling in that regard, theological. I mean, it couldn't be more dramatically different from Shankar Nayar's talk, where you're so over there. It's not obviously not a confrontational or polemical. So first of all, you go from investigation to polemic, and on the other, and the simultaneous movement is from metaphysics to history. Yeah. So the transition from investigation to polemic is also from the metaphysical to the historical, and from the vertical to the horizontal to the historical. So in terms of this series, immediately the difference couldn't be more dramatic between the pre-modern scene and the modern scene. And of course, as you pointed out, munazaras existed. I mean, the munazara scene, of course, even when I was young over here in Pakistan, and I don't know if you know this fellow, Ahmed Deedat. Yeah, this South African. So when I was young, we were all very excited by this fellow, and we were in our A levels, and this was kind of our socialization. This munazara, there was this modern colonial munazara thing. So it's it's still very, very relevant. So the same video store that used to make money renting porn films also simultaneously freely distributed Ahmed Deedat to save themselves, right? At the same time. But in terms of this this moment of historicization, yeah. So you think of somebody like Nānotvī, and you think, though, this is a completely traditional guy. Yeah. So this is what we would think, modern people. So how do you get? I mean, I want to ask more. One, how does the historicization actually work? Yeah, because I mean, it does. On the one hand, of course, there is. What's the difference between the historical regime of the past? Yeah, because history obviously is something that Muslims have been long interested in. Yeah. So what specifically is different between that historical regime and this new historical regime? And the second question, I won't take much more up, in terms of political theology. So the point that you made about divine and state sovereignty, yeah, which you are telling us is specific to colonial modernity, yeah. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this series, The Crown, about the current Queen Elizabeth. But the Netflix series, when it begins, it starts with a picture of whoever is playing Elizabeth, the actress who's playing Elizabeth, and it goes, "Hallelujah," right? So it's right. So the political theology is alive and well to this day, yeah. But I mean, one would think that actually political theology, after all, the shadow of God, etc. The political. So what's the difference between these older political theologies? For instance, Asfar Muin has written about. What's the difference between that political theology and this modern political theology? These are the two questions I had.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Do you want to take those first, and then I'll ask
as you, whatever format you want to.
Yeah, I think it's best if we do that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Sure. Thank you so much, Nauman, for the very rich questions and very important and interesting questions. I would say both in terms of both questions, the main rupture or difference is precisely this pressure to furnish some kind of a response that would satisfy these standards and these criteria that are of the making of the modern colonial episteme. So this idea of world history is, of course, historical empiricism or historical exactitude or standards is not something which is a modern invention. This has been going on for many centuries. And of course, the idea of history writing is very central to Islam, the works of Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Khalikan, etc. So it has a much longer history. But this idea that that one has to authenticate one's own moral arguments through standards that are from a certain kind of a Christian missionary environment. I think that is this pressure of establishing authenticity of history is something which is, I think, quite new. And the larger point that you raised here, I think, is that's precisely what I've tried to do in my other work also, and here also, is that when we look at the landscape of Islam in South Asia, in colonial South Asia, and of course we are living now, this is the legacy of our current present in India, Pakistan, elsewhere also. I think oftentimes we make two dichotomous of a wedge between the traditionalist actors and the modernist actors, etc. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, for example, is a so-called modernist actor, but he's very much part of the ulama milieu that he then critiques from the inside. Similarly, someone like Qāsim Nānotvī, he's the founder of the Deoband Madrasa, which is the bastion of one of the bastions of traditionalism. But these kinds of actors like him, or for example, the founder of the Barelvi order, Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, they're quite adept and flexible at wearing different hats and playing the kind of a traditionalist sort of Muslim theologian. In this case, Qāsim Nānotvī, of course, his larger munazara here is part of the larger Ilm al-Kalam tradition, but then he's very much aware of this larger pressure of the question of world histories. He's reading the newspapers in terms of what kinds of objections are being leveled, and we see this kind of an investment on his part to establish and furnish arguments that would satisfy these new criteria and these new kinds of anxieties and pressures that are around him in terms of the modern colonial episteme. So the larger point I would like to make is that oftentimes this larger conceptual question, which I think is central to your speaker series also, is how do we think about the relationship between colonial conditions, institutional, political, technological, etc., and Muslim discourse, whether that is coming from the ulama or modernist actors, etc. And I think in South Asian studies, and maybe in studies of South Asian Islam also, oftentimes the temptation of coming up with some kind of a blanket answer to what this interaction looks like between colonial conditions and Muslim discourses, it can be problematic. It's not just a relationship of rupture or continuity. There are both ruptures and continuities. It's not just a relationship of some kind of a Protestant absorption of the colonial epistemes. The colonial episteme brings with it this Protestant notion of Islam, and these Muslim actors then just absorb it and make it part of their indigenous discourse. There are different ways in which that encounter takes place. A Nānotvī is very different from a Sayyid Ahmad Khan writing in Tahzib al-Akhlaq and his journals, who is very different from an Ashraf Ali Thanvi, who is of course part of the Deoband tradition, but a bit later. So I think these specificities are very important to be captured. So that we can move away from this kind of a blanket or some kind of a generalized sort of conceptualization of the relationship between colonial conditions and Muslim discourse, to look at the specificities of this kind of an actor. He's using the technological conditions of colonial modernity, the train, the printing press and all of that, and is very much aware of categories like world histories, etc. But then he's relying on a much longer pre-modern Muslim intellectual history to make his larger points about the superiority of Islam. So the two can go together, continuity and rupture, engagement with colonial conditions and engagement with the larger Muslim tradition. So I think in South Asian studies, there has been so much of this problem space of deciding which side of the divide you're on, the continuity side or the rupture side, or do you call these traditions a Protestant Islam or a Protestant Hinduism, Protestant Buddhism, or something which is cleansed from the stain of colonial influence altogether? I don't think we need to be on either side of the binary, conceptually speaking, and the specificities are important to capture, and that we can do precisely by looking at the specific logics of these internal textures and conversations. And that, I think, precisely is the answer to your second question also, in that the new kind of political theology, the thing that is different is the state basically is a foreign state. This is after Muslim empire. This is after the fall of the Mughal Empire. So my larger question in this project really is, and this is how it connects, as Sajjad very astutely pointed out in his introductory comments. The first book, Defending Mohammedan Modernity, the question was, after the fall of Mughal sovereignty, Muslim political sovereignty, how do Muslim scholars and ulama debate the question of theological sovereignty, divine sovereignty, and its relationship to Prophet Muhammad's authority and the practice of everyday life? And that I offered as a conceptual frame to understand the Barelvi Deobandi polemic, rather than looking at this polemic as between scholars of the Sharia and Sufis, or Muslim mystics and Sharia-minded scholars, etc. And in this project, the question I'm interested in is that with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty, and as Indian Muslims have become a colonized minority, how do Muslim scholars engage with the pre-modern textual archive and normative tradition that was informed by and the context of which is the condition of Muslim political empire? So what do you do with a set of texts and a set of sensibilities in terms of engaging the non-Muslim other that come from a pre-modern tradition that assumes Muslim imperial political sovereignty in radically new conditions where you have a new sheriff in town, so to say, the colonial authorities? And what I'm trying to show is that these Muslim scholars are quite flexible and adept at recognizing the new realities that they have to engage with colonial conditions. There is no way to resurrect the Muslim state now, but then also draw on other notions of sovereignty. So that's how it's different from Asfar's project, for example, in that the political conditions have changed and these scholars admit it. They recognize that they're engaging with a new concept, a sociology of sovereignty around them. So I'll stop there.
Right. Actually, conceptually, if I may just add, so conceptually, in terms of the two historical regimes, clearly this word that you keep repeating is what makes them different, is world history. So there's no such conception. I mean, all the, so the major historical projects of this time, that's what's new about the kind of history that Shibli is writing, etc., is because there is this conception on the landscape or the palette of which these particular histories are then written of world history.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I gather. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nauman.
Sajjad?
Yeah, I guess I've got two things. The first one is sort of this this thing I'm thinking about in terms of religion as entertainment, or perhaps of religion as tamasha. So it's not to say that there isn't the carnivalesque in pre-modern kind of observation, but there does seem to be some sort of tamasha element of some sort of mela like this. This public which is there to be entertained, maybe to be persuaded, but I think it's more kind of like they want to see a sort of a contest, right? More perhaps than actually be rationally persuaded, perhaps, or persuasion in a more kind of rhetorical sense that one finds. So that kind of emergence, I think, perhaps is quite an interesting one of religion as tamasha, of which the colonial state is kind of a midwife who kind of facilitates that birth. The second one is about this rather interesting notion you said about enchantment wars, and how those enchantment wars, in fact, are entirely simultaneous with and actually exist within the same individuals as those who are articulating views of history and religion which strike one as being quite modern, right? So my miracle is better than your miracle because it's got more of the wow factor. Not just that it's scientifically impossible, it's just like, wow, it's astonishing. And that links to a point, actually, a question that Matt Melvin Kushki has asked, which is about where does the question of the magic and the occult arise in this? So, is there, for example, in some of Nānotvī's response to Dayanand, this idea that you guys claim to be the best tantrics, but we actually have the best tantric, who is the prophet, and our astral magic, in a sense, which is revealed, is much more powerful than your astral magic. There's one element of that. The other point that I'm kind of conveying Matt's question here is, as you probably know, Matt's very keen on this idea that modernity needs to be brought back a bit. So true modernity starts in the 15th century. And so you already have notions around magic, of power, of science, of history, already in the 15th century in the Timurid context, which prefigures the point that Nauman was making about Asfar's project, which perhaps are not so distinct from the ways in which history is then being kind of evoked in this 19th century context. There's already a kind of a world historical millennial concept of history, world universal history, which is already arising in the 15th century, which places, all religions, all historical phenomena at the heart of that, and at a kind of enfolding of that that sacred concept. So anyway, that's they're more kind of observations. They're not necessarily questions, but the questions are from Matt.
Thank you. I'll try to fold your comments and Matt's questions or comments here. The first point, I think that's absolutely right, that the tamasha and the sort of the seriousness of the proselytization go hand in hand. And it's interesting that these scholars are very much on board with this whole project of being part of this kind of an entertainment industry, but also with this very serious salvational project at the same time. So in some ways, the salvational project is being taken to the public. And that's also one of the sort of, I think, ruptures that we see here, in that the scholar is taking the religious argument to the public for its persuasion and for its spectatorship, so to say. And yes, the second point, that's precisely the kind of tension that I'm trying to capture, that on the one hand, there is this kind of emphasis on everything being historically exact, and this kind of championing of historicism and so forth. And in fact, as I mentioned, the larger sort of written paper here, that in fact Nānotvī plays the role of a comparative religion scholar and says that in fact, the early avatars of the Hindu tradition, Ramachandra, Krishna, etc., they actually had tremendous standards of morality, etc. And they, in fact, there might have been prophets that have come to India. I mean, that was one of the major questions for Muslim scholars in the subcontinent when they wrote about Hinduism: have prophets ever come to India? So most scholars actually said that when it comes to this question, and when it comes to the authenticity of the Hindu tradition, in fact, this Qāsim Nānotvī was being very polemical and confrontational and antagonistic. He, in fact, says in this very polemic that we don't know whether the Hindu tradition is authentic or not. It may well be authentic. It may well be that that prophets have been sent to India. And he then does this kind of a rise and fall model of history, that at one point this was an authentic religion. It could have been a true religion. Then later Hindus have added these accretions and these corruptions and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, there is this kind of a reformist investment in this kind of a historical exactitude. But on the other hand, there is this kind of sense that when it comes to things like miraculous enchantments and magical miracles, etc., that we have all the ammunition that will outperform you. So yes, there is this sense, and he believes in things like the supernatural and questions of the miraculous. And it will be interesting for me to look a bit more carefully at the category of magic in these discourses, and what might be the corresponding sort of category, etc. But in terms of this whole idea of harqul ada, this the exception to the norm, etc., the Deoband scholars, including Qāsim Nānotvī, were very, very much invested in showing Islam's superiority on that particular question. So the desire to historicize and the desire to establish the scientific certitude of things like miracles, etc., goes hand in hand with the desire to outperform the other when it comes to the enchantment index, so to say. So, and the last point in terms of the earlier precedents, what I would say is perhaps maybe one can then refine one's argument to say that these kinds of impulses that might have been around for a while became much further intensified come the 18th, 19th century, and have a certain kind of expression that is determined by the conditions of colonial modernity. But a lot more can be said. I think it's a very useful point that there are continuities. And again, the rupture argument, I don't want to overstate it, but I do want to sort of capture these shifts more carefully. Thank you to Matt and to Sajjad. Thank you very much.
No, I mean, I think that's precisely the issue, that we're going to be constantly throughout this series be stuck on this issue of where you find ruptures and where you find continuities. And one of the things that kind of struck me when you were talking was how different things might have been if the whole mela had taken place 10 years before or 20 years after. And I suspect a lot of the kind of the material contexts, but also perhaps even the language would have been very different, especially 20 years later. Because, we get the kind of the massive kind of rise of proper full-blown modernism even amongst the ulama, which would then very much change the way in which sort of questions are being raised. We have a whole bunch of questions and comments. Shall we just go through them in order?
Sorry, Sajjad.
Yeah.
Actually, can I just say something on that, because it's on my mind and it's a very important question. Yeah. So the idea of the world, the emergence of the idea of the world historical. I mean, it's what Koselleck calls the emergence of this idea of a collective singular subject of history. You don't have that before this time period. Yeah. So this is world history in a new kind of in a completely different kind of register, and it's related to the emergence of this idea of Islam as a collective singular subject also, and connected to, I mean, after all, the category of religion is necessarily simultaneously world religion. Yeah. So it's also connected to world history. So I think in that sense, as a collective singular, this is what we're talking about when we talk about the modern conception of world history. Is this are these collective singular subjects of world history? So now we can get to these questions.
Shall we start with Noor's, because it's directly relevant?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Noor Sobhan, her question is, do you think that the material destruction of the pre-modern Muslim textual tradition through colonial violence, for example, the looting in Delhi in 1857, shaped the emergence of new forms of Muslim intellectual production in the second half of the 19th century? And sort of linked also to what we were just discussing, she was also commenting that with respect to magic and enchantment and modernity, that modern techniques such as printing and lithography get harnessed in the effort to disseminate and develop the discourse around magic and divination. In what I've seen from the material traces of this in the printed archive. So I would certainly agree with SherAli that it's impossible to draw a dividing line with a clear rupture between the pre-modern and colonial modernity.
Yeah, and yes, the answer. Thank you, Noor, for your questions. The answer is yes to both of them. I think, and the point of the material destruction is important because oftentimes that's a point that we can that can get eclipsed in the larger sort of trauma when we think about the larger trauma of 1857 and this kind of drive to preserve some kind of an authenticity of one's religious tradition in competition with intra-Muslim others and inter-religious others, etc. I think the materiality of the destruction, especially of the textual tradition, that's, I think, an important element that can get left out. So I think it's a useful reminder that that also is an important part of that trauma of 1857. And the second point is also very important, that these technologies of colonial modernity like print and so on can go quite hand in hand with these larger sort of phenomena like the question of magic and enchantment and so on. So I think one really needs to go beyond these secular conceptualities of disenchantment, enchantment, etc. And what the quotation marks have to be quite in bold when one is invoking these categories. And that precisely is what I'm trying to do here. I think this whole very framing of looking at these Muslim reformers either as purveyors of a Weberian disenchantment or otherwise is not quite helpful, because they operate in these kinds of registers that don't quite map onto these kinds of 19th century sort of Western discussions on the division between enchantment and disenchantment, or the legal and the mystical, etc. So I think we need to move beyond these kinds of imposed binaries to look at the logics of the archive according to its own voice. Yeah.
And in fact, just to kind of continue that, I mean, Noor and I have talked about this quite a lot, but one genre which kind of explodes in the period, like at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, are these printed jantharis, right? These almanacs, which are all about the occult, which are all about, in a sense, magical practices. But they're also they're being facilitated by this this medium, but also the way in which they present them. So I mean, some of the earliest jantharis I've seen are from the teens and from the 1920s, and they had this very strange kind of juxtaposition of modern photos and imperial processions, right, alongside ads for like different kinds of services to like talismans and so forth. I mean, it's a real kind of strange mixture of material, which gets to the very heart of actually what the practice of faith and religion is for people. You know, I mean, I think
Yeah.
we forget that these manuals are actually quite central to the way in which people lived and still continue to live.
Yeah, yeah, and that actually also connects to these larger conversations, because oftentimes the kind of stereotype which has some basis, that scholars especially associated with the Deoband school have a certain kind of critique of popular practices, have a critique of excess when it comes to the conduct of the masses. They have a critique of the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the Maulid that I talk about extensively in my first book, etc. They have a critique of of religious passions getting out of hand when it comes to the public sphere. They have a critique of Muslim-Hindu sort of interactions in Diwali and other customs and so on. All that is there. Certainly there is a reformist impulse and push there. But these actors can be quite heterological in terms of their approach to these things. And Qāsim Nānotvī here, who's the founder of Deoband, is very much at peace with these kinds of notions of magic and miracles and etc. He, of course, believes in the supernatural. So this is not some kind of a reformist disenchantment which completely does away with the pre-modern world out there. And that's where I would sort of very briefly, perhaps, not disagree, but just add a sort of a sort of point to the kind of scholarship that we now see emerging in terms of this kind of push towards non-prescriptive Islam, or exploratory Islam, a pre-modern kind of in some ways. In us first book also we see this kind of a sort of a millenarian logic, etc. And one sort of misreading of these more sophisticated works can be that with the coming of colonial modernity, this earlier world completely gets washed away, and we see the emergence of this new Protestant Islam. I think it's much more complicated than that, right? So I think in these kind of works, like Professor Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam, or Asfar's work, etc., these are very sophisticated books. But one sort of misreading of these works could be that one can look at them and then come up with the conclusion that this is the end of an era, and the modern period is all marked by a kind of a Protestant Bavarian disenchantment. I think the kind of reformist programs of these kinds of schools are much more complicated than that. And I think your point here of precisely the Jantri materials, etc., and the lithographs that Noor is talking about, precisely reminds us that this whole continuity rupture paradigm does not always hold when it comes to the study of South Asian Islam.
Can I say something about that? I mean, sure. I mean, it's not just a question of South Asian Islam. I mean, after all, the occult dominated in a way that's being brought about, well, maybe not dominated, but existed in a kind of massive way within Europe as well throughout this entire period, and continues to exist to this day. I mean, the horoscope columns, which of course Adorno wrote about, the horoscope columns that the global middle class reads come from the West. Yeah, they don't come from from the East. Yeah. So yes, but I would like to say on this, I would also like to opine on this rupture question, the continuity, discontinuity. Obviously, there can be no absolute ruptures in history because that's materially impossible. Yeah, matter, everything that exists over here, matter implies continuity, so there has to be continuity. Yeah. Things won't simply disappear and new things appear out of nowhere. That can't happen. Yeah, it's materially impossible. But of course, the question would be what measure of continuity, what measure of discontinuity. History will always be about both continuity and discontinuity. The point about this, our time period, the period that we are talking about, and that's why I always make this reference at the beginning of this series also, to the Anthropocene, is that this is not just historically, but geologically unlike any other period in history. The discontinuities and transformations that we are talking about are absolutely unprecedented in human history, yeah, across the globe. This is by no means unique to Islam, yeah. So that is something that is undeniable. These discontinuities are incredible, yeah. And the difference they made in who we are and our relations with each other are also unprecedented. I mean, after all, nothing like the partition ever happened, yeah, in 1,000 years of history. We cannot discount the unprecedented nature of the events that have happened, especially over the past 150 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
There was that previous question from Ozair. to what extent were people from all religions engaging in these munazaras? To what extent were they aware or participating in the colonial formation of religions that they were attempting to undermine? In other words, if we accept the scholarly argument that, for example, Hinduism was invented by the British, which of course is not that straightforward, to what extent were people who you so eloquently described in your comments participating perhaps indirectly or by proxy in this invention?
Yeah, I mean, that's precisely what we were talking about earlier, that of course, that whole invention of Hinduism has gone through a lot of academic debate, etc. And I think one maybe distinction that might be useful to make when we talk about this relationship between colonial conditions and indigenous religious discourses, for lack of a better word, is a distinction between the technological and institutional conditions of colonial modernity, and then the intellectual and epistemic traditions that we see in traditions like Islam, Hinduism, etc. In that, as much as a Qāsim Nānotvī or a SherAli Tareen or an Ahmad Raza Khan, etc., might be very adept at using the technologies of colonial modernity, while the terrain always being a bit lopsided in terms of it's not a terrain that is of their making or choosing, but they're quite adept at nonetheless using the technologies available to them. The sort of intellectual arguments that we see, or the kind of reasoning that we see going into these kinds of arguments, have an interesting kind of a juxtaposition between the restraints and the pressures and anxieties of colonial modernity, and then the larger ongoing long-running Islamic tradition. So, in the further later chapters of this book, I discussed the question of cow sacrifice and the whole sort of debates among Muslim scholars about sacrificing the cows in the context of the Khilafat movement that pitted different kinds of Muslim scholars together. So there, of course, Ahmad Raza Khan, who actually interestingly is a chief rival of the Deoband school, but when it comes to Hindu-Muslim relations, there is remarkable similarity between the two schools in terms of how they look at that question. So he's quite adept at saying that, he's of course aghast at scholars like Abul Kalam Azad and Maulvi Abdul Bari of the Farangi Bahal school, who've argued that, we should not sacrifice cows as a way to show our sensitivity to the Hindu population and to maintain the alliance that we have with Gandhi to pressure the colonial government in terms of preserving the Ottoman Caliphate or the Ottoman government, the Ottoman state. So Ahmad Raza Khan is aghast at that, and what does he invoke to make his argument? He invokes the secular promise of the separation of religion and politics, and says that this is a matter of religious sensitivity to us, the sacrifice of cows. It's a symbol of Muslim distinction, Shi'ar-e Islam, which becomes a key category in South Asian Muslim thought by the 19th century. And if you pressure us to not sacrifice cows, that is intervening, that is meddling into the affairs of religion, and you have to keep the separation. So here you have a Muslim scholar invoking the secular promise of religious freedom for a very traditionalist legal imaginary through which he's trying to further the idea of Muslim distinction, or the preservation of Shi'ar-e Islam in the public sphere to maintain Muslim dominance in the public sphere over the Hindus. So the traditionalist imaginaries, traditionalist pre-modern imaginaries that are informed by the political context of Muslim empire in the pre-modern world, oftentimes are quite adeptly juxtaposed with the new categories and new possibilities of colonial modernity by these scholars. On the other side, Abul Kalam Azad and those scholars who are saying we should not engage in cow worship, they're using the same principle. They're saying the Ottoman Caliphate is the most important form of Muslim distinction, Shi'ar-e Islam, the Caliphate. So the British have no right to intervene in our religious affairs. So here again, we see Muslim scholars invoking new categories, religious freedom, and so on, for pre-modern Muslim desires and projects. So the two go hand in hand, and this relationship and this encounter is much more complicated than the invention versus absorption kind of model.
And in fact, that actually brings us to the very first talk with Faisal, when we were talking about the promise of empire and the sort of, the false advertising, basically, that people bought in that context, or perhaps eventually bought in that context. We have one very specific question, I guess, from Zahra Sabri, which is about the sources for this Shahjahanpur mela, because I'm assuming you're using Nānotvī's own account, but are there other accounts which may be will bring us to a different reading of what was going on.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Salam, Sarah. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, what I've used here is an indigenous Deobandi account of an eyewitness, a certain scholar who I mentioned in the larger chapter. He's not a very famous scholar, but he was an eyewitness to this polemic, and he writes this eyewitness account. And there are a few different kind of accounts within the Deobandi historiography. I know from scholars working on this from the other side that Arya Samaj apparently has their own historiography, according to which the dates are different, apparently the years are a bit different, and there of course the Ananda Saraswati comes on as the victor on top of this debate. My primary languages are Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, so hopefully someday I will be able to access that. But I know that Barton Scott at the University of Toronto, my colleague, he's been working on the Deoband, on the Shahjahanpur polemic that I guess has its own category in the Arya Samaj archive. So he's been working on that because he's working on a new book on the history of blasphemy law in South Asia. So there is an Arya Samaj account. I'm not sure about the Christian missionary accounts. I haven't really found yet some in terms of the British Library archives, but I need to go back and take a look. Maybe they have accounts of it too. But so far, my focus has been the indigenous Deobandi historiography. I think it will be a very interesting idea of a panel someday of the sort of the Muslim account, the Arya Samaj account, the Christian missionary account, and it'll be quite interesting to see how they looked at this from different perspectives. So we do have competing accounts, but in the Muslim tradition among ulama, this is the account that I have. I have not seen any accounts from other ulama, other groups of Muslim scholars when it comes to this whole. Of course, all Muslim scholars at this point are very much invested in the question of showing their championing of having undermined the Arya Samaj. And of course, one of the key sort of debaters against the Arya Samaj a bit later, of course, is Mirza Ghulam Ahmad at this time also. And there are other scholars also who are engaging in precisely these kinds of issues.
I mean, obviously there must be colonial accounts of this as well. Which would obviously be quite interesting because of how they would conceive of this question of representation, right? So yeah. How would they, define it? I guess, I mean, again, this is kind of like a very particular question, but within the Deobandi accounts, do you get any mention of those who would not be considered to be Deobandi as being part of this kind of Muslim tent? Or are they kind of written out of it?
In terms of the other Muslim scholarly groups, they are written out of it. So we don't see any mention of other Muslim scholars. But basically, the way in which the narrative is presented is that Qāsim Nānotvī is championed as the defender of Indian Muslims in this grave moment of threat against Islam, especially after the publication of Satyat Prakash and colonial missionary activity, etc. So, the people of Shahjahanpur invite him, and he's very reclusive and self-effacing. So he actually checks in at a local lodge under a different pseudonym, etc. So there is this constant kind of narrative championing of him as someone who's reclusive and self-effacing, but nonetheless the defender of Islam in this moment of grave threat. Interestingly, we also have accounts of other Hindu populations in Shahjahanpur, and there is this idea that after this debate, people were so convinced and so taken by his debate prowess that many people on the streets, when he would walk around, say that this is not a Maulvi, he is an avatar. So we see that kind of Hinduization of Qāsim Nānotvī, while he in fact Islamizes Hindu avatars in his own text by calling them, possibly they were also prophets like Krishna and Ramachandra. So there is this kind of cross-pollination, but he's presented as the representative of a Muslim public at large, which I think is another coming to Nauman's point that world history is a sort of a new kind of a category that we see that one would be hard pressed to find this kind of a collective history. The other, of course, key category is this idea of a defined Indian Muslim public. This idea that there is such a thing as a public which is to be defended, which is to be there is a Muslim public which is to be defended, and then a larger public which has to be brought into the tent of this this empirically enumeratable community called Muslims, which is part and parcel of this larger logic of enumeration, whereby identity basically becomes countable and hence accountable to its memory and history. So the whole world history paradigm actually goes hand in hand with this idea of a numerically enumeratable public, which these scholars are representatives of. Which of course is going hand in hand with this new notion of liberal democracy, whereas the modern state is in some ways representative of the popular sovereignty of each enumeratable subject in a community. So I think this this precisely is the political theology that I'm trying to capture here, of how the emergence of these new political conditions and logic of liberal democracy has its shadows on these theological discourses and debates, and this kind of syncopation between the theological and the political is what I'm trying to capture here. And the larger sort of mission here is that, the category of political theology, especially in Western academic studies, is most often invoked with this whole question of how the modern state is basically, a theological version of a secularized version of an earlier divine sovereign, sort of the theological underpinnings of the modern secular state. That basically has been the problem space of political theology. What I'm trying to do is invert that problem space by asking the question, how do these theological discourses among actors like these ulama might enable us and contribute us to think about political theology, not just from the perspective of the modern Western state as having theological underpinnings, but how that then informs these theological discourses, debates, both among Muslims and between Muslims and non-Muslims. So it's sort of inverting the problem space of political theology as a category, which is a larger theoretical kind of push, or the larger, kind of, one might call it the decolonial push that I'm trying to make in terms of how we think about this category of political theology. The ulama actors can really contribute to this whole discussion, is the larger point I'm trying to make here.
Cool. Do we have any other comments or any questions? Or Nauman, shall we wind up? You're muted.
I still have lots to talk about. It's such a rich talk, and SherAli is so extraordinarily articulate and thoughtful. But it's been an hour and a half. So the program was meant to be in about an hour. We've gone half an hour over, so maybe we should.
Yeah, I mean, if there are questions, comments, people can probably follow it up on the Facebook page, or they can email SherAli. We can maybe have, as I said, if we can convene a conference at the end of this year and maybe bring everyone together, that could be one way of continuing that conversation as well. Let's see what happens in this inshallah, post-COVID context. So in that case, I think we should just wind up. Should I just quickly mention our next seminar?
Yes, of course.
Next time, which is going to be in 2 weeks from now, we'll have Professor Ibrahim Musa from Notre Dame, who will be talking about discursive contestations in post-colonial South Asian Muslim thought. And I'm kind of intrigued to find out what he's going to be talking about. So please do join us then. And I guess it just leaves it to us to thank SherAli once again for a wonderful talk, which I'm sure people who've missed it will definitely enjoy listening to later. And hopefully this will provoke a continuous conversation that we'll have over the year. So thanks once again, SherAli.
No, thank you, Nauman, Sajjad, and for the series. It's really been a lot of fun. It's been really a great pleasure to be in conversation, and we'll continue the conversation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. It's a great honor that you gave me your time and your great questions. So the conversation will continue, but thanks so much. It's been a true pleasure and honor.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Khuda Hafiz.